Super. So before we start, let me briefly introduce Alexis to the class. Alexis is an urban strategist from Melbourne, as he was saying. He worked for many years at the urban think tank, and also worked for the government, right, in Australia.
Yeah, that was my first chapter.
For foreign policy, true. Yeah. He was also Richard Rogers fellow, which I'm very envious of. It's something that I definitely want to do at some point in my life. Living in the Wimbledon house must be a dream. And he's also been a future architecture fellow and a finalist in the City of Sydney's Alternative Housing Ideas Challenge, as also a participant in the Seoul Biennial of Architecture and Urbanism. And I mean, we'll see how much how related the work and research and interest that Alexis has been pursuing in the last few years and that I've been closely following from afar is related to our studio. So thank you, Alexis, for joining us. And yeah, the floor is yours.
Thanks again for inviting me. And I have to say, like, looking at the concept for the studio and the syllabus, it's definitely, there's a lot of alignment with issues and sort of evolving kind of situations around finance and the connection between finance and ownership and then the spatial expression through architecture that I'm really interested in. So it's definitely, I'm very interested as well to see how some of the projects from the studio actually end up as well. I decided to call this lecture Captive Markets, and I think I probably won't explain now. I think it'll be obvious as I go on. But I'll be focusing predominantly on rental housing and this sort of the implications of this shift from ownership to rental, both from a kind of societal and political perspective, but then also through to architecture and design as well. But I think just to begin, this lecture and my thinking around this topic has really been influenced by 3 cities that I've spent time living in. The first is Melbourne, where I wasn't born in Melbourne, but I predominantly grew up in Melbourne. It's the city you see here. And the other 2 are Zurich, where I lived for a number of years, and then also London, which probably didn't live as long as I would have liked to, but I did have a very nice time in that Wimbledon house, as Eduardo said, and had the sort of space and opportunity there to actually try and understand some of the dynamics that were happening in London. And I came to see London as a bit of a canary in the coal mine for dynamics we'll start to see in other cities around the world as well. But as you see, Melbourne, for those that haven't been, we're approaching a population of 5 million at this point, growing quite fast. Actually, one of the fastest growing cities in the world, I think, besides Mexico City. A lot of that is through immigration, but it also, what the implications in terms of the city itself is that it is this huge sprawling city. But what is, I think, really, what has been kind of fundamental growing up in Melbourne to my life and my thinking around housing is this idea of the Australian dream, which is probably quite similar in many ways to the American dream, although I think the American dream is more about the idea of a meritocracy, and that if you have the will and the energy, you can sort of achieve what you want. The Australian dream is very much framed within the idea of property, and particularly ownership of property. And you see, this is an ad from the 1960s, literally selling the dream that utopia is a project home that you buy with a house and land package from a developer. But the dream is not so much the home itself, it is the ownership of the home and having your own little piece of land where you're the master and you decide what goes on there. And that has really been fundamental to Australian society even up until the present time as well. But this is also I think this is also where there's some connections to the American experience, is that it is a natural outflow, I'd say, of the process of settler colonialism as well. Melbourne itself is a city that effectively grew on the back of land speculation. It was not, Sydney was the original colony in Australia, and Melbourne was a place where people came effectively to carve up the land into subdivisions. And this is an ad from the 1880s, which was when Melbourne grew into one of the largest cities in the world at that point. And it was on the back of a speculative property boom, and that then resulted, as these things inevitably do, in a bust. But I think the key thing for me is that to understand, and I'm sure this is something that you've been covering in the studio, is that ownership societies like Australia are a political project. And in this way, I would also bring the US and the UK into the fold. I also would say here that I know, Eduardo, that you're looking specifically at Madrid for this studio, and there are some very also strong connections with the experience and the kind of the role of home ownership in Southern European countries as well. But for today, I'll specifically focus more on the US, the UK, and Australia. And I think, though, that the road to being ownership societies was slightly different in these three countries. I think in the US, obviously, you're going to be looking at the role of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and that kind of the government support for mortgage financing as a kind of political act during the New Deal under FDR. And of course, that was partly in response to the impacts of the Depression, but also this idea of building a nation of homeowners. In Australia, that was explicitly a goal of the government we had that was in power for 20 years, basically for the full length of the post-war boom under Robert Menzies. And that was a Liberal Party here, which is the equivalent to the Republican Party in the US. And they knew as a political strategy that to build a nation of homeowners would also build a nation of Liberal voters whose number one priority when they voted in elections was actually house prices and really tying their political identity to ownership of this asset, and which made them very sensitive to the way that the real estate market fluctuated. And of course, in the UK, this probably came a little bit later in the 70s with Margaret Thatcher and kind of the rise of neoliberalism. Before that, the UK was like a lot of the rest of Europe, very committed to the welfare state as a response to the devastation of World War II. But then you had, again, in the 70s in the UK, this very strong political push on home ownership for very similar reasons to what happened in Australia a generation earlier. And the kind of result of this is that these three countries have historically had some of the highest levels of home ownership in the world. As I said, you could add countries like Spain, Greece to this as well, that as they came out of World War II, they didn't go down the route of a strong welfare state. They went more for this kind of self-help approach. So what happened is that home ownership in countries like Australia, US, and UK has really been a political force, but also a kind of structuring social element in society as well. And of course, this has implications for the way that cities grow, for the way that finance flows into the housing market, but also for the way that how people perceive renting in these countries, and for the way that renting is regulated in these countries as well, and the kind of protections there are for renters, whether you have rent controls and the sort of the ways that landlords are often protected in these systems over the rights of tenants. But of course, what we've seen in more recent years is is this kind of social compact, I guess you could say, start to unravel in these countries, and it's really then causing a lot of issues around what happens when countries that have been built and societies that have been built on not just the dream but the real opportunity for home ownership start to unravel, and what does that mean when suddenly you have this emerging generation rent that not just doesn't have the same opportunities as the generations that came before, but is also forced to live in a broader context of rental housing that has been shaped by the idea of rental housing being either transitional tenure, which is generally when you're a young adult before you move naturally I should say, into home ownership, or it's a sort of it's a marginal tenure for people that are on low incomes and can't afford to buy, or have sort of shocks in their life that mean that they fall out of the ownership market. And of course, there's certain cities and countries where this is really acute, and London, I think, is perhaps the worst of all in this sense. And of course, there's a whole kind of media narrative and kind of discourse around this, saying, well, this is actually not about the fundamentals of the housing market. This is about the lifestyle choices that our generation is making. Whether it's because we like brunch too much and we're just spending too much money eating avocado toast, or this idea that millennials are the post-ownership generation, and we're not interested in owning objects. We're interested in having access to services and access to experiences. Of course, and I should say, I actually went to a university with this guy who made this comment that became viral around the world. But of course, we know actually that this is not the case. This is not about lifestyle choices. It's very much about the role of finance within the housing market and the unaffordability in multiple cities around the world because of the way that finance has inflated the housing market into bubble situations. And this is a particularly acute impact in Australia, in Australian cities. Sydney and Melbourne are two of the most unaffordable cities in the world, which is definitely how I first came to get really interested in some of these topics, but then also, of course, living in London as well and seeing the effects there. And I wanted to touch on two implications of this. And obviously this is why I called the lecture Captive Markets. I see this emerging generation rent as a captive market, and you start to see different kind of financial interests that have realized this and realized the potential then to actually focus on this market as a business proposition. And one aspect of this, I think, is rental housing as a new frontier for venture capital. And when I say that, what I'm talking about is really the tech world starting to realize that there are opportunities to actually develop digital platforms or digital services that are starting to take advantage of the fact that the user experience, which obviously user experience is fundamental to a lot of Silicon Valley thinking, the user experience of renting in countries that have bad rental systems is actually very poor. And so you see here, this is an ad for Spare Room, which is, I think it's much more prominent in the UK, but this is one of the largest rental platforms in the UK. And there's a little, probably should have made the text a bit bigger, but in that bottom left corner, you see the tagline on this ad campaign is "Find the perfect roommate for your imperfect apartment." So it's really, the idea here is that there are things that you can't influence. You can't influence the spatial qualities of rental housing. You can't, I think by implication, you can't really influence the structural problems of rental housing. So what you can do is use a digital platform to try and make the best of it. But prop tech, as as this sector is called, actually encompasses a lot more than just finding roommates. It's everything from online real estate agents to virtual viewing, to sort of different forms of investment that sort of sit below full home ownership. A lot of work around data valuation and analytics, which is not really the public facing side, but it's probably the where most of the investment has gone into. But then also a lot of products that are around property management, and essentially, as I said, just trying to make the user experience of renting more palatable to people who are forced into this tenure not by choice. And you see that there's this development of this sort of seamless ecosystem that, as a renter, everything from this kind of algorithmic matching with a flatmate through to the property search, the interaction with agents, the virtual tour. I mean, obviously some of these things are actually quite useful in a COVID environment. But I think that they were developed to really to try and automate, find efficiencies, and kind of create these seamless ecosystems for renters, so that you sit within a walled garden of a particular service, and obviously you're also generating data and generating revenue for the different interests within the rental housing market. And this was a very kind of big focus of mine during my time that I spent in London, because I think that London is really at the leading edge of this movement. I think partly because it has this confluence of factors. You have, it has the largest tech scene in Europe. It also has a very strong fintech scene, so financial technology scene, probably one of the biggest in the world because of the role of London as financial centre. But then also it has this very apparent generation rent there. And so I think these three factors together mean that PropTech has probably progressed further in London than anywhere else. But it's actually become a huge global movement. In the 3 years to 2017, investment in the PropTech sector tripled. So there was this clear focus of the tech world that, wow, this is this uncharted territory. And of course, you can see something like Airbnb is the first mover in that sense, coming out of the 2008 crash. But now PropTech is really a booming element of the tech industry. But I think this quote from Alistair Parvin, who, if you don't know, if you haven't heard of Alistair Parvin before, he was the founder of WikiHouse, and has also done some work. I think his office is now called Open Systems Lab, and he's really looking at how you can use technology to kind of democratize more so the building process for housing. But I had a really interesting conversation with him when I was in London. He made this comment that the point of the technology will transform our relationship with housing and land, but it's not going to happen in a meaningful sense if we just bolt technology onto the same broken market. And I think that's what you see with PropTech currently. It's taking models of ownership as a given. It's taking systems of tenure as a given, and it's just trying to build on the user experience. At the same time, there also is this this sort of more blue sky thinking, which is really influenced by the idea of the access economy and this shift of so many different industries to an as a service model, whether it's software, this whole list here you see. And when I say as a service, you see something like software, this shift from actually buying, Adobe products that you download onto your computer, run from your computer, to having a subscription to Adobe products. In the same way, people are starting to talk about housing as a service. And this again ties into this this media trope around millennials being interested in on-demand services rather than actually owning a car. Instead of owning a car, you just want access to a car through Uber or car share services. In the same way, a lot of people are talking now about housing as a service, as a future model of housing where you have access to housing rather than owning housing. Of course, you can make the argument that rental housing that we've known for hundreds of years is housing as a service, but that doesn't fit into this idea of that kind of originates from Silicon Valley. I think I should say that the additional thing, though, that is part of this housing as a service discourse is how you bundle extra services to housing. So you can also kind of connect it to the idea of the hotelization of housing, and also the use of data to drive user experience, but also to sort of harvest information about users as well. And also the idea of applying this to networked real estate assets and developing, I hate this kind of language, but like a platform for living. And you see this, as I said, it's not in this kind of space, it's not really just about providing a room that you rent, it's about all these other add-ons that actually are where the revenue is generated within these models. And you see it most obviously to this point in co-living. And obviously co-living has been influenced by a number of more kind of social and community-oriented models that emerged in the past, and some of these actually are also connected to what we see in cooperative housing. But in this kind of corporatized form, and again, you see some of the most prominent examples of this in London for the same reasons that I mentioned before. It really is about this idea of I'd say appealing to emotional capitalism, as a great exhibition at the CCA in Canada that was talking about this in a broader sense. But I think this definitely fits into this, and selling the idea of co-living as an antidote to social isolation, or the kind of atomized life that people are feeling that they're experiencing in cities. But actually, it's not really about the idea of the collective. It's about the idea of selling these much smaller footprint living spaces selling access to these much smaller footprint living spaces like this one, where you get less than 10 square meters of private space, but actually paying premium rents. And the trade-off is meant to be access to these great communal areas, but really this is a model that's based on shrinking footprints and then selling this kind of lifestyle dream. The other thing I want to touch on, which I think co-living tends to get a lot of focus, I think, because it is this, partly because there's a lot of kind of PR interest about promoting that co-living as a model. Also because I think it fits in with a lot of the philosophies that you see coming out of Silicon Valley and other kind of tech capitals. But I think the bigger financial investment in rental housing is actually happening not in co-living, but in build to rent, or what in the US is called multifamily housing. And that's where you have not venture capital, but actually these very large kind of pools of institutional finance starting to move and really start to shape the city in new ways. This has taken off in a huge way again in London, but in the UK more broadly. And you see, and I think for a number of reasons. One is around the post kind of 2008 search for yield, as interest rates have dropped to zero, and traditional sources of investment, sort of investment return for institutional capital have evaporated. There is much more of an appetite then for build to rent as a lower returning investment, but a stable investment. And also in the US context, there's also this almost kind of vulture capitalism that emerged, where very large investment funds bought up foreclosed properties after the subprime crisis and converted these into build to rent, essentially, or just rental property more broadly. This is an example of a development in London around Wembley Stadium that is the largest single site build to rent development in the UK. It's going to eventually have 6,000 build-to-rent units, all managed by a single, developed and managed by a single large landlord. And it's very interesting the way that this project has been marketed. It's been, you see here the kind of appropriation of this almost kind of Soviet modernist aesthetic to sell build to rent as a revolutionary product, when really, as I was saying before, it's tapping into this captive market of generation rent, and not really changing any kind of fundamental structures within the housing market that have led to the emergence of generation rent, and that have foreclosed these pathways into home ownership. You see the same thing. Actually, the largest institutional interest globally for rental housing is Greystar, which is an American company, although it's moving into many countries around the world, including now into Australia. And you see these are some slides from a leaked investor deck from Greystar that show pretty clearly how, as a company, it sees the opportunity here. It explicitly says that unaffordable housing is causing social discontent in cities around the world. And at the same time, these large corporate landlords haven't really moved into this space in a meaningful way. And so you see now, this is the CEO of Greystar, but Greystar now has almost 500,000 units that it owns and manages globally as a vertically integrated company. And within the US, it's the #1 manager and developer of rental housing, and it's 3 times the size of its nearest competitor. So this is really, if any company is emerging as the kind of, like the Google of rental housing, it is Greystar. But that's the kind of context that that I was initially thinking about housing, and about the role of finance and capital in housing, and about what it means to live in an ownership society. But at the same time, as I said, I also spent about 6 years, living in Zurich. And in many ways, the alternative title for this talk could have been Learning from Zurich, because I think that Zurich, particularly the cooperative housing model that you find in Zurich, is almost an antidote to a lot of these trends that you see in these ownership-based societies like the US, Australia, and the UK. And I think it's the value in the model of cooperative housing that you see in Zurich is not just it's for a few reasons. It's about the longevity of it, the scale it's managed to achieve, and also it's the sense of innovation that it continues to produce as well. So just to provide a bit more context, if you think back to the version of this slide that I showed earlier, just with these Anglo countries, when you add Switzerland to the mix, you see that Switzerland has actually never had more than 40% home ownership nationally throughout its history. And actually, if you start to zero into Zurich, specifically within the Swiss context, the city of Zurich if those countries are ownership societies, the city of Zurich is a renter city fundamentally. It has only 9% home ownership rate, so more than 90% of the people that live in Zurich are actually renters. And I could touch on, I think, how that has shaped the broader regulation around renting, but I think just to keep this lecture more succinct, I won't. But needless to say, there is, even if you don't live within cooperative rental housing in Zurich, there are a whole range of protections because of the tenant focus of that system that mean that even renting in a normal rental context is still far, far, far preferable than the experience in countries like the US, UK, and Australia. but I think, as I said, the really important thing that we can learn from Zurich is connected to the cooperative housing model. And this is a model that really, as you tend to see in a lot of these sort of innovative models or systems that emerge in different contexts around the world, they often emerge from crisis. In Zurich, this was a crisis in the late 19th century. It was again very similar to Melbourne, connected to a speculative property bubble that made housing quite unaffordable at the time. But then also the devastation of World War One, and the acute housing shortage that followed World War One, and also high unemployment within the construction sector. And so you saw this sort of, again, this kind of confluence of factors where you had a socialist, a democratic socialist government in power in Zurich at the time that was very influenced by broader kind of philosophies of the European labour movement at the time. You had this need to try and stimulate construction within the city and also to provide housing. And so initially the cooperative movement in Zurich emerged out of that context, and it had strong state support, predominantly through the provision of cheap land on the then edges of the city, but then also this kind of alignment of interests around companies that wanted to provide affordable housing for their workers, and also these emerging social and kind of community movements as well. So this image is just showing the construction of the first ABZ housing project in 1920. ABZ is now the largest housing cooperative in Zurich. It manages more than 5,000 rental units across the city, across multiple projects. And there's a selection of annual reports that you see from ABZ over time. And I think what is interesting is that initially cooperative housing as a kind of architectural typology in Zurich was very much influenced by garden city movements. Garden city itself, in its original incarnation, was actually, in a way, kind of a bit of had an underpinning element of like a community land trust cooperative model built into it that was never really explored in most actual garden cities that were built around the world. But what you saw was really this kind of low density approach to development, influenced as well by hygiene kind of movements of the time, and trying to provide green space for workers, trying to provide space for food production within these developments as well. But over time, the cooperatives in Zurich also realized that they could expand their portfolios and provide even more affordable housing if they densified on these sites. And so this was one of the first sites that they actually earmarked for densification. Still what we call medium density. It's not high density by any means, but they started to actually grow their portfolios not through acquiring more land necessarily, but by densifying the land holdings that they already had. But also, what's interesting about this site is that it was the first moment where this more kind of traditional entrenched cooperative movement met this more countercultural movement that was emerging around squatting in Zurich, and I guess across Europe actually in the 70s. And it was one of the first squats in in Zurich was a kind of formalized squat where the cooperative ABZ, as a transitional measure, actually allowed this group to squat the existing buildings on this site before the construction began. And this is really important. I should say this is just a poster of the time that was from this group, and this idea of life instead of profit. So it was already really starting to pick up on some undercurrents in Zurich society at the time around speculative housing, which was starting to pick up steam in the city. But as I said, it's really important because I think that the cooperative, the cooperative model we see in Zurich today actually is has been fundamentally shaped by some of these countercultural movements and kind of oppositional movements. And I think it's definitely important in the context of your studio because, and this idea of non-ownership models as a form of resistance. This kind of resistance movement within Zurich was able to realize a lot of ideas and act on a lot of ideas that it had because of this this institutionalization of the cooperative model historically within Zurich, and they were kind of almost able to use that as a platform then to build on. A quick little bit of history about Zurich. People say the 60s came late to Zurich, so actually that whole kind of countercultural movement and questioning of established norms happened in Zurich in the early 80s. There was significant social unrest in Zurich sort of in that decade from 1980 to 1990. There was a youth movement that was very active, and that also kind of dovetailed as well with a few other things that were happening in Zurich. There was a government that decided to relax laws around recreational drug use, which meant that Zurich actually, despite the kind of clean reputation it has now, became one of the drug centers of Europe during this period. That caused a lot of families to desert the city for villages or kind of outer suburbs. It also, at the same time, there was this shift in Zurich from a manufacturing economy to a more knowledge-based economy. And so a lot of housing in the city was actually being converted into offices. And this caused a huge speculative bubble in the city where housing became unaffordable. And that's almost where this countercultural movement around new forms of living and questioning the kind of status quo started to also pick up on these problems within the housing market and the kind of financial interests that were making housing unaffordable in Zurich. And a sort of sub-segment of that sort of squatting movement, which was very political, decided to actually start to think about what are the alternatives to the way that housing was typically being delivered and within this context. You had figures like Hans Widmer, who at the time was kind of known as PM, that were very influential in this context. He published this pamphlet called Bolo Bolo in the early 1980s, which was very much trying to explore these ideas of how you could potentially retrofit these existing kind of perimeter block typologies in central Zurich into more self-organized, sustainable living and working complexes. So this is, as I said, very much a kind of countercultural idea that was starting to be superimposed onto the existing urban fabric of the city. But what happened was that those ideas actually were picked up by architects, funnily enough, and started to be explored as both the kind of potential, what potential could this have for the actual spatial design of housing to bring some of these ideas of collectivity and non-speculative financial and ownership models together. And what you saw, that there were some initial projects that I won't talk about today that explored this, particularly one called Kraftwerk 1, which was really the first of this sort of new generation of Zurich cooperatives, which were more urban, which were higher density, and which were more led by architects and people that had this more oppositional approach to housing rather than this very established group of cooperatives that had become quite corporate, though still non-profit. But I think one of the projects in Zurich that actually best represents this today is one called Calbright, which you may already be aware of. What was also interesting about Calbright was that it was developed on land that was still owned, or is still owned by the city of Zurich. So there was also this transition in a way between the relationship between the cooperative movement and the city itself in Zurich, where the city in the post-war era stopped actually selling land to cooperatives to develop, and instead moved more into a leasing model where they would maintain ownership of the site and agree a ground lease with the cooperative to then develop a project, which they would eventually gift back or sell back to the city after 60 years. This was one of the sites, as I said, Calbright, which was to that point used as an open-air tram depot. It now has one of the kind of showpiece cooperative housing developments in Zurich on it, which was completed in 2014, designed by an office called Muller Sigrist. And this image probably doesn't do justice to the project, but it was designed really as a microcosm of the city on a singular site. It's designed as a perimeter block, but with a very mixed use. Like the entire ground plane is given over to non-residential uses. It's still actually a functioning tram depot. The trams, you can see, can actually enter into the ground floor, and the whole development has been built on top. The interior courtyard is actually public space, so it's not just for residents. But I think that the key thing here is that Calbright delivers a kind of level of and quality of housing that is actually far exceeds even what often luxury developments in Zurich can attain, and that is done really through a community-driven process and a model of cost rent that I'll go into in a moment. But this has become almost a new benchmark for what apartment living can be in Zurich, and the types of communal spaces and services that you can provide within an affordable housing context. The scale of this new generation of cooperatives has also started to increase. You have projects like this one called Mehrers Wohnen, which is more than living, which was actually done. It was kind of almost a super cooperative where a whole lot of different cooperatives came together to develop a cooperative precinct to celebrate the 1 century of cooperative development in Zurich. So there's 13 different buildings designed by different architects on a site, and again, it's exploring ways to really kind of maximize community within developments of this scale. There's a strong focus on the ground plane for active uses, whether it's retail, cultural, community, or office. And then also a really strong focus on sustainable, enabling sustainable ways of living. But you also see, because of this scale, and you see this in Calbright as well, the ability, and also not having to abide by kind of commercial imperatives, the ability to experiment spatially. And I think there's something else that you're probably really focusing on within your studio, is not just what can these models achieve in terms of societal impacts, but also how can they then open up new opportunities for spatial experimentation and rethinking conventional housing typologies. And I think one of the key examples of this that's really emerged across multiple projects in Zurich is the cluster apartment, which you see here. This is in one of the buildings in Mehrers Wohnen called House A, which was designed by Duplex architects. And this is really, in a way, like a much better version of something you would see in corporate co-living, where each person or couple has their own sort of mini apartment with a bedroom and a kitchenette and an ensuite bathroom. But then these are kind of arrayed around really kind of attractive communal areas, including communal kitchen, so that you then start to almost develop these micro communities within these larger buildings. And this is particularly great for families who can then start to kind of share things like parenting responsibilities within larger groups. Also with, there's one of the really interesting trends that you see in housing in lots of cities around the world is the rise of lone person households. And this again is a way to kind of allow lone person households to live within these more social environments as well, which is particularly important for example, older women that live by themselves or older men that live by themselves still feel part of a community and have that kind of intergenerational connection. You see some even more kind of experimental ideas emerging in very new projects like, sorry, I'll just go back to this one here, which is on this space, if you can see my cursor. It's the second project done by the Kalagas Cooperative. It's called Zoll House. This again is being done on land that was leased from the, actually not from the city of Zurich in this instance, but from the SBB, which is the train operator in across Switzerland. They redeveloped land across near the main train station in Zurich, and part of it they gave over to the Kalagas Cooperative to develop Zoll House. What's really interesting here, though, I'm sorry if these plans are not super legible, is and that they're experimenting with different typologies, including cluster apartments, but also what this typology here, which is almost the most direct kind of translation of squatting kind of approaches that you see into a more formal housing typology. So what they've actually designed is a completely open kind of structure and framework for housing that a group can then come in and kind of build out in the same way that in the sort of original approach to squats or even lofts, for example, in New York, people would find these old post-industrial buildings and actually build them out themselves into these new experimental forms of collective living. And so you see this is an example that one is, this project is just kind of being completed at the moment, but this is the sort of thing that's happening within these spaces where people are really starting to try and customize these much larger spaces to their own needs. And the idea is that then when these people who are renting now move out, the next people that move in, again, have this kind of blank canvas to work with. And it has a lot of parallels as well with the open building movement that you see in other countries, where you're providing the shell and then allowing, in that case, normally owners to kind of fit out to their specifications. But here it's this more dynamic model where renters can come and go and continually kind of iterate the space. I probably should get a move on, but what's really interesting about this model as well, that it has been successful for infill housing projects as well. So here's an example of this called Dreieck, which was a site that was planned to be demolished by the city for a large road project. You had strong community opposition, and then which was eventually it was initially a squat. In that sort of meanwhile period before the demolition happened, and then eventually the space was granted to this group as in a cooperative context. And here you see Dreieck. Dreieck means triangle, and it's this triangle which they then renovated and also added new buildings into. So that's also a model to kind of update the existing fabric of the city. And I should say this is very kind of, that was a project that I walked past almost every day when I lived in Zurich. And you can see the kind of affordability benefits that accrue over time with this model. This was my apartment, 40 square meters. And someone living in Dreieck at the time was getting more than double the space for the same amount of money. So you see the kind of the multiplying affordability effects of these models over time compared to the private market. I'm not going to go in depth into the cooperative model. There is a lot of information that you'll be able to find if you're interested in the kind of nuts and bolts of it. But I think just the key things to take away are that it is an affordable rental model. It's very much connected to this idea of cost rent, which is try to capture in this slide, but really that the rent that you pay is directly connected to the development costs of the site. So you can almost think of it as a non-profit version of build to rent. And what that means is actually the rent in year one is the same as the rent in year 20. And so that's actually really where a lot of the affordability benefits start to kick in, is that typically in a rental market, rent will be raised every year and they'll go up and up. So if you can keep rents flat over time, the kind of discount to the market that you're able to achieve is larger and larger and larger. And I mean, in that sense, cooperatives in Zurich now that are looking for sites in central Zurich generally aim to beat market rents by about 10% in year one, so that they know that 30 years in, they're going to be significantly below that 10% figure, potentially 20, 30% below at that point. When they're building in outer suburbs where land costs are a bit cheaper, they'll actually aim to beat market rents by 30% in year one. So then that's where you then end up with these rents that are far, far, far below market after 10, 15 years. What you also see in Zurich now is the kind of maturity of this model, where they're starting to actually explore high-rise versions as well. So it's sort of moved from garden city to medium density to now trying to achieve even higher density projects that maintain the kind of integrity of the philosophy and also this really strong focus on community and spatial experimentation. You also see that this is a model that doesn't even necessarily require development or architecture. It is a pure ownership model that can be applied to existing buildings within the city. And in that sense, you have these other groups like Wogano, which is a cooperative that actually buys up existing buildings and converts them into cooperatives. And so over time, they're actually starting to systematically remove speculative housing, speculative properties from the market and convert them into these non-speculative models. I'm just going to quickly now play a video, which is actually a project that I've been working on.
The financialization of housing in cities around the world has become a generational challenge. In 2011, residents of Zurich voted in a local referendum on affordable housing. As a result, 33% of the city's rental units must operate on a non-profit basis by the year 2050. Zurich is a city of renters. Only 9% of its residents own them.
Sorry, were you able to see that video?
No, we couldn't get through it.
Sorry, this is where I should have taken advantage of your IT people. All right, let me just try that again.
Will you try sharing the screen and then play later?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The financialization of housing in cities around the world has become a generational challenge. In 2011, residents of Zurich voted in a local referendum on affordable housing. As a result, 33% of the city's rental units must operate on a non-profit basis by the year 2050. Zurich is a city of renters. Only 9% of its residents own their own home. Non-profit development is already well established in the rental sector due to a rich 100-year history of cooperative housing. Responsible for 70% of all non-profit dwellings, cooperatives are a critical counterpoint to the speculative market, but new affordable housing projects are not being developed fast enough. As Zurich's overall rental stock continues to expand, non-profit developers are struggling to achieve the growth necessary to meet the 2050 target. And with private capital flowing into the city's overheated housing market, large buildable sites in central Zurich are increasingly rare. Lacking the deep pockets of speculative developers, those that do become available are out of reach of cooperatives. In this challenging context, centrally located odd lots represent an unrealized opportunity, smart densification, embedded within the city's existing urban fabric. Irregular in size and shape, they are complex sites that lack appeal to for-profit developers. Drawing upon the City of Zurich's open spatial datasets, we are beginning to identify and analyze unbuilt odd lots. Applying customized code, we are able to link GIS information with building regulations and automate the search for promising sites based on a range of input parameters. This use of iterative digital planning tools allows the latent qualities of underused land in the city centre to be revealed. Recent cooperative projects in Zurich have explored ways to bring together work, living, and cultural infrastructure. More than housing, they offer shared community amenities, contributing to vibrant local neighbourhoods. But by dispersing these spaces across a cluster of smaller buildings within easy walking distance, a series of interventions on odd lots could form the basis of a distributed cooperative. From libraries to co-working facilities, communal eating spaces to personal wellness retreats, these programs would be integrated with new affordable housing and underpinned by a custom-built digital platform to manage and coordinate their collective use. The strategy also responds to the idea of the extended home. The distributed cooperative model allows for a simplified and tailored space for private habitation, though with a living footprint that expands through access to shared spaces within the building cluster. By distributing collective resources across multiple networked locations, the model looks outward rather than in, encouraging residents to engage with their surrounding urban environment and local community. Barriers between private and public space are blurred, reimagining the way we think about housing at a neighbourhood scale. As clusters multiply across Zurich, a growing network of distributed cooperatives can offer an updated model of sustainable shared living and a collective, human-centered vision of the smart city of the future. The financialization of housing in...
Okay, so that was a project that I've been working on with some collaborators called 10 in studio. 10 studio in Zurich. We produced that for the Sol Biennale in 2019. But really, I mean, as the video said, it was trying to respond to what we saw as some of the barriers to the further scaling of the cooperative housing sector in Zurich, which were really to do with the problem of trying to acquire land to kind of compete with private developers, particularly in a context where cooperatives couldn't really, there wasn't much potential to densify their existing land holdings, and the city was really starting to run out of sites where it could lease that land to cooperatives. And our really not solutions, I don't like to talk in solutions, but our kind of response to that was to try and identify these overlooked sites within the city and start to try and think how, instead of looking for a large site, you could actually rethink the idea of a cooperative and all the kind of amenity that it provides across a cluster of smaller sites. I think also we were trying to think about how some of these prop tech type tools and and digital kind of strategies could actually be harnessed, not just to think about the user experience of housing, as I touched on in terms of co-living and these prop tech apps in London and kind of platforms that have been developed for build to rent projects, but actually to be used meaningfully to help identify sites and then also start to tie these sites together. So that's a project that we're still working on. We had some support from the city of Zurich for the Seoul Biennale, and we're sort of still trying to work with them to build out the digital platform that would help automate that search for sites. So kind of watch this space. And also we did some sort of initial designs for what some of these sort of micro interventions could look like as well. So this was a kind of almost like a future retail showroom, and trying to think, well, if the future of retail is more experiential, we don't really need to put that on the ground floor. This could be on an upper floor and have almost more of an event type flexible space. And then, you know, we're also looking at, well, on the left is a short stay suite, so also building in this kind of flexibility you have through things like Airbnb, but helping it be one of the things that makes the cooperative viable as well. On the right was a library, so as well trying to create deliver all of these amenities that would normally be considered luxury, but actually in Zurich are kind of delivered within these very affordable contexts. Same thing on the left here was what we called a wellness retreat, but again, the ability to have, you know, almost like a Zumthor-esque communal bathroom where you could, because of that sharing quality, you could actually have something that's quite beautiful and very unique, something you could never have in your own home if those resources were divided amongst multiple people, and then a rooftop as well. For the Biennale, we made a bit of a kind of fake advertising campaign for this as well, just to show that you could make it sexy. And we also, and actually there's sort of more detail on this project if you're interested in a recent edition of Mono, where we kind of explain some of the ideas around it and some of the design influences as well. And I'm sorry that video, the quality wasn't great once you do it via Zoom, but you can find it on Vimeo if you search for the distributed cooperative. Another project that I've been working on, this is more since I returned to live in Australia about 1.5 years ago, is actually trying to think about how you can bring these types of models to ownership societies. As part of a piece that I wrote about cooperative housing in Zurich a few years ago, I had a conversation with Andreas Hofer, who was really kind of one of the key figures in this second generation of cooperative housing in Zurich. He was a student who was very active in that kind of protest movement in the 1980s, and then was behind Kraftwerk 1, which I mentioned earlier. And he made this comment that you can't export the Zurich model one-to-one, and that you actually have to sort of bring a kind of localized, you have to develop a localized version of it. He also made, I think, this very important comment about all of the kind of vested interests within housing markets, and the role of crisis in triggering, opening space for new ideas and new models to actually take root. Obviously, we're in a COVID crisis right now, and so you could argue that the time is potentially ripe to explore that. And so together with two collaborators here in Australia, Andy Ferguson, Catherine Sunderman, we entered a housing ideas competition that the City of Sydney ran, and actually were one of the winners with what was our attempt to translate the Zurich cooperative model to a Sydney context. these images are from, sorry, this image is from a pilot site that we're exploring. And I think some of the key benefits really that you start to see when you apply this kind of model to sites and see the opportunities that then start to emerge are things like not having to maximize site coverage with and build out the full site, which you often see in Australia, this kind of boundary to boundary building. So we could actually include this sunken courtyard in the centre to use as a childcare facility. We also had a really strong focus on the site, even though it's a private development, delivering public amenities. So we created a lane through the site and kind of arrayed a number of non-residential uses along that lane, like co-working and some hospitality, and also an incubator for local social enterprise. And so these sorts of opportunities, you start to realize that when you tweak the financial model, suddenly the assumptions that a developer brings can be challenged. We actually got to a really exciting point with this, where at the end of that process, with a couple of the other winning teams, we were in conversations to actually do a feasibility process for this actual site, which was currently an on-grade car park that's owned by the City of Sydney. Unfortunately, the sign-off on that feasibility process was meant to happen 1 week before the first COVID shutdown in Australia, and understandably the City of Sydney suddenly had to question their use of their budget, and so that was put on pause. But it was these models are really starting to have a lot more interest in Australia because of the conditions here. This realization that the private rental sector is not really equipped to deal with the sort of number and diversity of people that are starting to rent in Australia. And I think you'll see the same interest starting to emerge in the UK and also in the US as well. So sorry, that was probably a bit longer than I was planning to go for, but I hope it was interesting. And I guess I just want to leave you again with this idea of utopia being home ownership, and really how we can start to challenge that and actually show that utopia can be these more cooperative models where you can get all of the kind of bells and whistles that you'll get in these more expensive co-living developments, but actually deliver them through social and community-led approaches. So I will leave it there and I'll stop sharing.
Great, thank you so much, Alexis. That was amazing. I would invite students to turn on their cameras so we can all see each other's faces and start a conversation. While students also organize their thoughts, I have already sort of like an initial. I have many comments. First one, I'd say I find the distributed cooperative really interesting. It's something that we're also exploring in the class. Well, the idea of the conceptual idea of the archipelago is like a network system in which there's not a sort of a top-down sort of structure, but actually individual or independent entities that all at the same time sort of collaborate into one larger system that doesn't have like a specific scale or size. They're just all interconnected, but at the same time, highly independent. But the question that I wanted to ask is, where do you see sort of like the next crisis coming, in the sense that if the 2008 housing crisis, completely sort of shifted the mentality of homeownership towards a rental system, and capitalism took a few years to sort of take that, right? That's what capitalism does, right? Like it takes something that we liked, repackages it, and sells it back to us. It's like and we all like buy it immediately. But where do you see again, sort of the next crisis happened in terms of in terms of people being able to having to depend on rents as a mode of survival. I think it was Hegel who defined rents as the most sort of exploitative mode of living, in which you always depended on your landlord, who always would sort of oppress you, right? In this case, now if your landlord is not the mom and pop investor, but is large corporations that we can't put a face on, that we don't even know who they are, and sometimes they're it's pretty much an algorithm what owns or what manages our home, and not an actual person. How can we what do you think of how can we even be more resilient to that sort of mode of living? But B, also, when is this bubble, or how is this bubble gonna burst? Because we'll have to burst at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, and I mean, I think at this point, because I am back living in Australia, I'm very immersed in the Australian context, and what has been, it's almost like the curtain has been pulled back, and you sort of see the Wizard of Oz behind the scenes, like actually pulling the levers on the housing market, because Australia, like most countries around the world, the economy here has been really impacted by COVID, by the shutdowns. As the unemployment rate has skyrocketed, and for a moment there was a lot of talk, okay, maybe this is going to be the end of the Australian housing bubble, which has gone, which has been a bit unique, because unlike in the US and the UK, we didn't have an end. The bubble didn't burst in 2008. It just kept on getting bigger. So we had almost 23 years of uninterrupted housing price inflation in Australia. And what happened for a few months, it kind of tailed off, and then it's actually skyrocketed again. And the reason for that is because interest rates are so low. And so it's not that people have more money, it's that people can actually borrow more money than they could before. And there's been and at the same time, there's been lobby groups in Australia that are starting to push back on some of the lending restrictions that came in after 2008 to say, actually, no, you should allow people to borrow even more money again. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, and again, as well, because of these really low interest rates, and this really, it also kind of flows onto capital not really flowing around and not really having a place to park that gets much of a return. I sort of touched on this when I was talking about build to rent. Like the reason you have these large corporate landlords now is because they're willing to accept lower returns. Mm-hmm. And so you almost have these two things going on in Australia now out of this crisis, which are people are taking on even more debt, and Australia has the highest household debt in the world. And at the same time, you also have this opening for large corporate landlords here that is probably a bit of a delayed reaction compared to what happened in the UK and US after 2008. I think that, to me, the crisis point that's going to come out of that is that you're going to have even more people locked out of ownership, because prices are just going to go up and up and up. And it's going to create more inequality and more frustration. But at the same time, I think people won't actually like, as you said, the sort of creeping domination of a few large corporate interests in the rental sector as well. Mm-hmm. So I think that there is going to be this realization that if you have so many people renting, and there is no prospect of ownership on the horizon for a large chunk of a generation, there needs to be alternatives within the rental market. And I think in Australia, that's probably going to be enabled by government. Like, government is starting to realize that this is another way to deliver affordable housing, in the same way that it happened in Zurich. It wasn't that cooperatives there were able to just kind of grow into this meaningful part of the sector through their own accord. Like, they did rely on certain kind of government structures that open the space for them to grow. And I think that, to me, that's what's going to happen, because there's also, in a way, a crisis of public housing or how governments actually deliver affordable housing, I think in all developed economies across the world, like there is this aversion to just building public housing in the same way that it was done in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I think there's more and more focus on how do you actually seed these models within the community sector so that then they're able to develop. I think you see this more in the US now with community land trusts. And I think that to me is like where the crisis will open up possibilities. It's obviously going to be different in cities where COVID actually leads to a new foreclosure crisis, which it might. I think that in those cases, there's going to be a choice the governments will make whether they decide to allow a kind of collapse of the home ownership market, or which they did obviously in the US, and that opened the space for companies like Greystar to step in and buy all of these foreclosed properties, or whether they actually see that as politically toxic and try to make sure that they maintain this kind of ownership society at all costs. And that's definitely, I think, where the Australian government is. Like they will continue to try and shore up that political constituency rather than allowing this sort of group of homeowners to be wiped out and not able to afford their mortgages anymore. But if they did, that would obviously open up possibilities for new kind of community models as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, that is also happening in the US right now. In the last few years, like companies like Starwood, Cerberus, or Blackstone have been buying enormous amounts of housing stock for rent. And the problem also, it's not only the fact that these large corporations are starting to control large chunks of housing, but also the social repercussions that those practices carry, right? And also in the case of the US, the like systemic racism that is carrying, right? That these companies many times are practicing like new forms of redlining and housing discrimination that are much more difficult to identify because, again, you can't put a face, you can't put a name to the person who you're renting or providing or allowing you to rent your house. But there are these sort of large corporations that many times don't even reside in the country which you live in, right? So anyways, I want to open it up to...
I mean, just on that note, there was something that I didn't mention about that Kalkbreit project, and I think it's something that has also been picked up by other cooperatives now in Zurich as well, is that they actually have a kind of leasing strategy for their apartments where they look each year at the demographic mix of Zurich as a whole and try and reflect that in their tenant community. Mm-hmm. So they're very intentionally trying and kind of break down social barriers and the kind of retreat of different groups into more insular communities. Mm-hmm. And so they will do that on a gender basis, on an income basis, on an ethnicity basis. They'll reserve a certain number of apartments for recently arrived migrants or refugees. Like they'll really try and create a strong mix. And the only thing that really is precludes you from living in cooperatives in Zurich is once your income gets too high. But it's even that limit is quite high. Like you can be sort of firmly middle income and still live in a cooperative. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely something, that kind of approach I think is also you can see as an alternative to that type of discriminatory kind of leasing practices that you're referring to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'd like to open it up now to the students, or the ones remaining at least. Guys, any questions, comments, or observations? Come on, give me at least one.
I guess we had a question about you were talking about like the effect the pandemic would kind of have on some of these real estate processes, and we were wondering like if the pandemic is going to kind of encourage like exodus from cities and then like encourage more like home ownership models, or if like you were saying before, like ownership models are going to kind of collapse because people aren't going to be able to pay their mortgages, or I guess how people are seeing how like the pandemic and the economic fallout from it will kind of affect home ownership and rent models in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I think there's two questions there. I think, as I was saying, like it's almost a country by country situation in terms of what the pandemic will do for home ownership, because I think the levers, the government really has choices to make about in these ownership societies about how important it is for them to preserve mass ownership. I think in general, no government wants chaos to happen, to kind of ensue out of the crisis, and so I think they'll, like most countries around the world, there'll be at least, even if there is going to be a transition where there's more rental, they'll probably try and like soften that landing so it doesn't happen all in one go. I mean, in Australia, we had moratoriums on evictions for people who couldn't pay rent. There was also kind of, I don't know how long it was, maybe 6 months, where banks, people were allowed to just stop paying their mortgage for that period of time. The banks accepted it because they also didn't want a whole lot of people to default on their mortgages and cause like, real problems within the financial system. So there's almost like a whole set of interests to stop a complete crash happening. I think though this, as I said, like there are these trends anyway that were pre-existing in countries like the US and the UK and Australia towards a growing private rental sector, and then the pandemic is definitely not going to stop that happening. I think the question around whether people will leave cities, I'm personally skeptical that that's going to be a serious kind of shift in the way that cities are developing. I think there will definitely be a kind of shift to hybrid work modes where you work part of the time in the office and part out of the office. But I think that there's just not so many jobs that require proximity and adjacency to, even if you're not in the office, you do want to be near things that are relevant to your work, or you want to be near family and social groups, or you want to be near the kind of the life and amenity that cities provide. But I think that one interesting thing that you do see is that and it's not just cooperative housing. You see in a lot of these sort of the contexts, like the projects that have been developed through these alternative models, often you've seen a much higher level of resilience to things like lockdown. So we have another model here in Melbourne called the Nightingale model, which is still kind of speculative build to sell model, but it's essentially an architect as developer model where they cut out the kind of premium that a developer would normally charge, and the architect develops the project and makes their money through the design process rather than through having to have a margin on the development. But it's a very kind of community-oriented model where, and you see during our very long lockdown here in Melbourne, like living in a Nightingale apartment complex was much, much, much more preferable to living in an apartment complex that was just developed by an investor, partly because of just things like access to natural light, ventilation, more generous communal spaces within the building. So they have nice rooftops. So even though you were kind of confined to your home, you could still go up to the rooftop. And just a sense of community and kind of mutual aid that developed in those contexts. So I think that there is, coming out of the pandemic, even if you put the kind of rental ownership question to the side, there is, I think, a huge reappraisal of what makes it good, like like medium to high density living environment, and how these different models can actually deliver much more livable, much more livable forms of urban development that are more resilient when you have these types of experiences like the pandemic.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm also skeptical that the pandemic will change our lives or the way we understand living. I think, at least in Spain right now, at least in the case in Madrid, the pandemic has not halted the real estate market at all, and prices keep on rising. Developments keep on being approved. The amount of residential buildings that are being redeveloped to and redone as luxury housing in Madrid every week or every month is like, it's crazy. And the pandemic didn't give a halt to that, probably because also the money that is direct to those developments is not Spanish. That's probably why too. But anyways,
I mean, I think the other thing about the pandemic as well is that for people who haven't lost work or lost jobs during the pandemic, it's actually been a period of enforced saving because you just can't spend money on stuff. And so that's also what you see in places like Australia, is that it's actually creating even greater problems of inequality, because people that kept their job and have kept their job during these last 12 months have actually been able to spend, like, have more capital to actually buy housing, and that's driven up the price of certain types of housing as well. It's also been quite interesting to see, maybe this is probably less relevant in Europe, but it's definitely places like Australia where there's been bans on movement in and out of the country during the pandemic. You start to see how certain subsectors of the housing market, like student housing, for example, which were completely dependent on international students, they have collapsed. And so it has been a very kind of clarifying moment, I think, for a lot of, to sort of expose all of these different subsectors within the housing market, and how if you just switch off certain capital flows or certain or something constrain the potential market, how it actually has these very immediate impacts.
Mm-hmm. Anyways, if no one else has any other comments, we will let Alexis go and enjoy his Saturday. Alexis, thank you so much for the talk. That was fantastic, and the conversation doesn't end here. These are topics that we will keep on discussing and exploring in the class. So we'll keep you posted about our endeavors.
Yeah, no, I'd love to see how some of the projects develop, and I think also for anyone who's specifically interested in cooperative housing, like, there's a lot more information about the sort of the nuts and bolts of the model that you can find online. But I think from a design and kind of spatial perspective, there's a great book. I'm just looking over to my book. So they're called New Housing in Zurich: Typologies for a Changing Society, and that it's almost like a survey of new cooperative projects from this second generation that I've been referring to. And there's 4 plans. There's they sort of look at it both from the kind of precinct scale right down to the plans for individual apartments. And so there's a lot of interesting kind of detail in that book as well. So hopefully the university has it in the library, but if not, I'll definitely recommend it. It's something to look at.
Great, amazing. We'll definitely take a look. Okay, great. Thank you so much. We'll be in touch.
No problem. Thanks again for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.